Okay, Alina is a research ecologist at the University of Washington. Welcome.
Hey folks, happy to be here. I'm going to be presenting a couple pieces of what was my dissertation research that I wrapped up in December, some of which is in press and some of which we're still trying to get out the door. And a lot of this work was focused not specifically on whitebark pine, but I was working in whitebark pine communities near treeline and subalpine parkland. So I was interested in Alpine-Treeline ecotones generally as a landscape feature and how they might be affected both by climate change and wildfire. So the areas I was looking at extended from the forest line up through subalpine parkland and treeline, and I wanted to see how the different components of these changed. And specifically how they changed in response to modern fires in this area. For this talk, I'm going to try to emphasize some of the specific observations related to whitebark pine, but there's a lot of other pieces of this research that if you're interested in, I'd like to talk to you later about. The motivation for this, I don't have to tell probably this audience, but we've seen a lot of fire increase in the last 3 decades, and we expect that that fire on the landscape is going to continue to be important in an era of warming climate. And so what I wanted to know was when you zoom in on the landscape, are the climate-driven changes in fire regimes that we think we're currently seeing affecting the Alpine-Treeline ecotone, or is it acting more as a refuge from fire? And our fire is actually not extending up here. So in this particular fire, it burnt all the lower subalpine forest, but sort of stopped when it got into the tree line. So I wanted to know how likely these areas were to burn. With this idea that as tree line and tree limit moves up with fire, could it suppress the tree line down and slow that tree line advance? Or would it alternatively not reach tree line, and these could be important refuges? So the first piece I'm going to tell you about is in press right now at International Journal of Wildland Fire. And this is just a big, large GIS exercise in many ways, looking at how much area is burning in subalpine parkland and alpine vegetation in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. I wish those nice maps of whitebark pine habitat had been available when I started this, because it would be interesting to look at that now as well. But for right now, I'd like you guys to focus in on the blue areas on the map, and those are areas that were mapped as subalpine parkland of different vegetation types. Most of these will contain whitebark pine as a component of the ecosystem. The orange areas are alpine vegetation, which included not just alpine tundra, but avalanche chutes and shrublands as well. But focusing in on the blue, I crosswalked that with the data from monitoring trends in burn severity, and that database only has fires over 400 hectares. I had a 29-year period that I did this with, and I excluded areas that were considered unburned. I think especially looking at high elevation systems, there might be mapping errors where they draw the boundaries of the fires to include areas that didn't actually burn. So I'm focusing only on the areas that were mapped as burned. There's error with this data set, one way or the other. But if I included the areas that were classified as unburned, it didn't really change any of my results besides the numbers, the overall amounts. And so for the whole region, so this whole region, sorry, let me go back here. The areas in black are the mountainous ecoregions in the Pacific Northwest, so that's my study area. I'm only including the mountainous parts of it. So for all those mountainous ecoregions across the Northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest, a 5-state area, I have plotted here on the top the, do I have a laser? Yeah. So the black line is the total area that's burning in that region over the last 29 years. And then the blue line is the subalpine parkland that likely contains a component of whitebark pine, and the red line is the alpine areas. Now, the most obvious thing that jumps out here is that, yes, this area that's burning up high is tracking the regional trends. Whether this is because the climate is synchronous, so climate is warm and dry up high when it's warm and dry down low, so things can burn, or if it's because fires are spreading from low to high, we don't know. Moreover, this bottom graph is, unfortunately, I'm sorry my label's cut off, the proportion of that area that burned. So the black is the proportion of the total mountainous area that burned. The blue is the proportion of the subalpine parkland that burned, and the red is the proportion of alpine vegetation that burned. So what we would expect based on historic fire regimes would be that subalpine parkland, which has a longer fire return interval than the whole landscape, would burn proportionally a lot less. It would be less likely to burn than the landscape. Same thing for alpine vegetation. We see that with alpine vegetation. We got, one anomalous year. Not sure what happened there. Actually, I am sure what happened there. That was the 88 fires. And the rest of the years it tracks a little lower. What's interesting, though, is we see a number of years where subalpine parkland is burning proportionally more often than the landscape as a whole. And if we add up the total numbers across the whole ecoregion, the subalpine parkland over the 29-year period, 7% or 0.07 proportion burned, and 8% of the whole landscape burned. So it's really tracking what's going on in the landscape. And I thought this was pretty interesting. If we break this down by ecoregions, we see different results in different ecoregions, and it's specifically in the Rocky Mountains, we really see that the subalpine areas are leading the charge in the amount of area that's burning. In 4 ecoregions, the subalpine parkland burned proportionally more often than the landscape as a whole, including the Columbia Mountains, Northern Rockies, Canadian Rockies, and Middle Rockies. A couple other things that were interesting to me in this, you definitely see the Idaho batholith area jumping out as an area where there's just a lot more fire occurring on the landscape. And in the Blue Mountains, the alpine vegetation burned a lot more than the regional vegetation. I'm not really sure what that was. It wasn't due to just one fire event or just one year. That's what I first looked at. So if anyone from that area would like to talk to me about why that's occurring, that's somewhat interesting. So the take home I want to give you guys is that there's a number of possible causes for this. Some of them could be related to climate, could have elevation-dependent warming, but we don't have strong support that it's actually happening in our region based on the climate data that has been assessed so far. Could be local increases in fuel connectivity in the subalpine parkland are making fires more contagious there. I don't believe that this is the case because I found that younger trees in the second part of the study in the subalpine parkland don't really burn that well. In California, they think that this might be causing some increases in the fire in the subalpine there. And then increases in flammability in the adjacent subalpine and other forest types. And this is what I personally think is driving this, is we're having contagion from other vegetation types, especially continuous subalpine forests like lodgepole pine that weren't included in my data, driving this increase. And it's a landscape effect. And then, of course, there's also the effect of fire management. And I do think, at least in the Idaho area, we're probably seeing sub-signature of wildland fire use being really important. So from that context, that fires is and continues to be an important factor in these high elevation areas that's going to affect how they respond to climate, what does that mean on the ground? So I collected data at 4 field sites, 2 in the Northern Rocky Mountains and 2 in the Cascades. And the 2 in the Cascades, one was burned in the 1980s and one burned in 1994. And in the Rocky Mountains, one burned in the 1980s and one burned in 1994. I originally intended to have this one a little closer, but a whole bunch of fires during 2012 when I was sampling got my way. So I had 531 field plots across these different sites, and all of these were subalpine fir, whitebark pine communities. The 2 sites in the Cascades had a much higher component of alpine larch, but alpine larch was present in all sites. I sampled these sites using a 5 meter by 20 meter sampling scheme horizontally across the ground, so parallel to the slope. And I'm going to look at 3 different questions in this part of the talk. I also looked at some other landscape pattern effects as well. But for here, I want to talk to you about how fire changed the forest structure and how that affected particularly the composition of tree species and what species were most abundant in regenerating after the fire. And I came in with this with some a priori hypotheses. based on my experience with fire ecology and other systems and my knowledge of the species traits in this system. And first, I expected that larger trees would be more likely to survive the fire, that whitebark pine might be more fire resistant because its branches slope up, and there's been some evidence that it is more resistant to fire, and that whitebark pine might regenerate better after fire. Now, my sampling occurred 17 to 25 years after fire. That might not be long enough to see whitebark pine doing better. But those were my hypotheses coming in. At each plot that I sampled, I reconstructed the pre-fire conditions for overstory trees. So if trees were dead, I determined whether or not they were killed by the fire and if they were standing before the fire, or if they were dead because of the fire based on how they burned. So if they were deeply charred, the boles were deeply charred, and they had lost all their fine branches, and they were an older legacy tree that had been dead before the fire. If they were still retained fine branches and were only missing the bark, I assumed they were killed by the fire. Obviously, there's some error in reconstructing these areas, but fortunately, things don't decay very quickly in these high elevation systems, so we have pretty high confidence that at least we were close to most of the reconstructions. Okay. For each plot, I also did an assessment of the burn severity, which then I categorized into unburned, low, moderate, and high. There may be some error between the unburned and very low categories. For example, if the grass was scorched and there was no charring of the surface, I probably couldn't reconstruct that. But in most cases, we saw charring on some of the wood was still present. So to answer my first question about overstory size structure, trying to understand if smaller or larger trees were more likely to be killed and how the total mortality varied across different levels of fire severity, I assigned trees to a size category, either small or large, and did an ordination of that data to look at the greatest variation in the data. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ordination methods, it's just a way to simplify a complicated amount of data. So I'm going to show you these, and then I'll try to explain them. So this is the data that I ordinated with the size structure of the trees. Both the pre- and post-fire plots are on there, and these arrows show the direction of change from pre-fire to post-fire. So this first axis basically represents the total amount of tree density. And as you'd expect from before to after a fire, there's a decrease in density. What was interesting and unexpected, the second axis goes from very large trees to very small trees. And all the plots had an increase in the relative abundance of smaller trees. And I saw this when I broke down the data as well. We had much higher mortality in the larger tree size classes than in the smaller tree size classes. So this is the opposite of what you'd expect from, say, a low elevation ponderosa pine forest. The larger trees are being killed by fire, and we're moving to a forest that's dominated by smaller size classes. And at 3 of the sites, mortality, the higher the fire severity was, the greater the mortality in the larger size classes. And then how did fire change the overstory tree species composition? So not only are we losing the larger trees, but is there any influence of fire on the tree species composition by changing the relative abundance of the trees? And this is where I also found a somewhat surprising result. I expected that whitebark pine would survive the fire more often than the other species. So these numbers are the mean percent mortality at each site. And at 2 of my sites, it's slightly lower than Aves lasiocarpa, which is subalpine fir. But a couple of my other sites, it's much higher, or the air overlaps. So at least in the fires that I went and sampled, I certainly don't find any evidence that whitebark pine was better able to survive the fire. There was a lot of dead whitebark pine on the landscape already, and I'd be interested in knowing from fire managers who are actively looking at fires burn if that's helping the fires spread into whitebark pine communities, because we certainly saw deep charring in the dead whitebark pine that was on the landscape, and a lot of evidence that the fire was spotting and not moving through the ground. Very heterogeneous pattern of burning. And just for those of you who are interested in alpine larch, it has very low mortality, which was also surprising to me because I expected it to not survive the fire very well, but it seemed to be able to avoid getting burned even when there was fire right next to it on the ground. So that's an effect of fire not carrying very well. Okay, so this is the last piece here. And this is regeneration. So this is seedling density at each of my 4 sites in response to burn severity. So did I see any effect of higher severity fire having higher regeneration of whitebark pine seedlings? So the first graph I'm showing you here, I'm including all trees less than 1.4 meters. Some of those were likely alive before the fire. And in this graph, I see no increase in seedling regeneration or abundance of seedlings in response to fire severity. There's higher abundance of these seedlings in the lower severity plots, with the exception of Engelmann spruce. If I focus on, if I focus only on seedlings that were in the smaller size class, like less than 0.1 meters, I see a similar pattern. The only site where I saw a higher regeneration of whitebark pine with high severity fire was maybe at Butte Creek, but it's not significant. So what I found in summary is that regeneration at these sites is not really responding to fire severity at all. And what I think brings up a discussion, these sites were subalpine parkland to treeline. There wasn't necessarily a lot of competition already. So when we talk about restoration strategies of whitebark pine, I think it's important to have the context of what the site's like already and how big a problem competition is, because there's some sites where we might not be having a big competitive exclusion effect on the seedling density. It's also possible that there just wasn't enough time yet here to see this, because whitebark pine regenerates and persists over a long time. So take home from my work in the field is that the larger trees were more likely to experience mortality in the fire. That included most of the larger trees were whitebark pine. And whitebark pine was not any more resistant to fire-caused mortality than other species. And whitebark pine seedlings were less abundant in severely burned plots in most of my sites. And this work was supported by the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, Western Mountain Initiative, Joint Fire Science Program, and a whole lot of help from assistants in the field.
Thank you, Alina. We have time for a question or maybe two. Yeah. Diane? Oh, do you want?
Hi, that's really interesting. One question I had, you did mention competition from among species, and one thing that we found from our post-fire regeneration sampling is that herbaceous vegetation, in particular grasses and bare grass, were really detrimental to the establishment, say, of whitebark pine, but probably other seedlings as well. Did you do understory as well?
I did do understory sampling as well, and I also sampled for how many facilitation things were present, and I honestly haven't done that modeling yet. So I will say that a lot of places where there was a denser understory was not where we were seeing overstory whitebark pine at these sites. So that might be in the Cascades. In the Rocky Mountains, it does seem like there could be a bit of a competitive effect, and we can talk about it more. Yeah.